Stanley Sandler. I'm a historian, and I like to collect old antique toys, for example, among other things. You can see behind me a lot of models and so on. And the interesting thing I was just thinking about today, this is a Royal Mail car, mail truck. It's put out by Dinky Toys, and it is from the late 40s or early 50s. Now, the thing I find particularly interesting about this is you see a Royal Mail truck in London today, and for the last 50 years or more, it'll say ER on the side. This one says GR for George VI. And George VI was Queen Elizabeth's daddy, George VI. He ascended the throne when his brother Edward abdicated, a story you probably most of you know, abdicated, and George was not the Prince of Wales next in line. He was the Duke of York, so he was next to the next in line. And so when Edward VIII abdicated for the love of the woman he loved, who had to be an American woman, twice married, so she just wouldn't do for the establishment in England. So then George VI ascended the throne. And you may know George VI from the movie came out about 7 or 8 years ago called The King's Speech, and it's about how George VI, who had a really fairly bad stutter, and he had a guy called Logue, Logue, to teach him how to speak without much stuttering. And it was a difficult job, but he mastered it. And the King's Speech was when he gave, I believe, the Christmas speech of that year. And so George was a nervous person, he was not the ebullient type that his brother was. His brother was the sweetheart of the British Empire. George VI, or when he was Duke of York, was just, a royal prince. But George VI, he saw England through the tail end of the Depression, 1936 to 1939, the coming of the war. And then he saw England through World War II. And he really gave very deeply moving speeches, despite his handicap over the BBC, and really became a beloved figure in English history. He was not very healthy, and his health was not helped by the fact that all of the royal family of Windsor were inveterate smokers. I mean, they just smoked and smoked. And in those days, people, it's not good for you, kid. But otherwise, they all smoked. And he smoked very heavily. And but of course, the royal family in those days was nothing like the royal family today. If King George VI were alive today, he'd turn over at his grave. Things we don't know about the royal family that we know today, and we didn't know about George VI's addiction to tobacco. But then again, it wasn't considered all that horrible in those days. But he had developed a lung cancer, and when he was had a major operation towards the end of his life, and the word going out was, well, he's worn out by the war and everything. I mean, what would you expect? But it really was, the major operation was a lung cancer operation, and then I think a year after that, he died. And it's kind of a poignant way that he saw Princess Elizabeth off at the airport. She was going on a tour of Africa when England owned a lot of Africa, and she was there in a hotel, a well-known hotel called Tree House. It's up in a huge baobab tree, I think it was. And there she got the word that her beloved father had died. And they were very close, the two sisters, Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose, and King George VI. So she had to fly back then, of course, and was greeted at the airport by all the cabinet officers, including Winston Churchill, who was prime minister at that time, greeting her as she got off the plane, and then to assume her role as the new monarch of England. And it was very poignant. And but then with it seemed as though with the death of George VI, things changed in England for the better. See, they've been through, first was through the war, and then after the war, something seemed almost as bad to blokes, and I was over there at the time, austerity. And they were saying, we have to, anything we build now, we have to make, like automobiles particularly, we have to sell overseas, especially the Yanks, because they've got all the money now. And so while English was recovering, nonetheless, most of what the good stuff was going overseas. And so from 45 to 53, England was in a period of austerity. They even had austerity clothing, very simple, rugged clothing, austerity eyeglasses, which looked horrible. And of course, that was from National Health. You know, they passed the National Health Act in 1945, which guaranteed absolute free care for everybody for everything. And and since then, a lot of Americans have been saying, "Yeah, we ought to have that too." But it became very expensive. But nonetheless, it was very popular in England. And during the Korean War, which would be still under the reign of George VI, the first part of the war, the British were involved in the Korean War. They sent actually an entire Commonwealth division composed of Britishers and Canadians and Australians and whatever. They had to pay for this, and so they put a tax on eyeglasses and on false teeth. And for a lot of really people who believe that free healthcare was the Ark of the Covenant, that everybody has to have it, they resigned. Aaron Bevran, for example, who was a fiery Welshman and quite left wing, and he resigned from the government. Said that the idea of paying even a relatively small amount of money for any kind of healthcare is abominable. So, and that was one of the major accomplishments of the labor austerity regime under Prime Minister Attlee, and then of course under King George VI as well. So he went through a profound period of change in Britain, from being one of the second major power in the world. Well, maybe disputing that with Germany, disputed it in World War II, and then after the United States. But after that, England, it really seemed to. Here's the odd thing: was on the skids, but then the blokes are living better than they ever lived. Okay, and you could argue this was the fair shares for all program of the austerity period. But anyway, George died, and all that this sort of improvement came about in 1950, beginning of 1953, with ups and downs, of course, with the coronation of Elizabeth II. I was in England when George VI died, unexpectedly. Although when you look at his health, you'd figure, well, it wasn't so unexpectedly. And the whole country shut down for a week. And all the BBC, which was the only radio they had then, played nothing but funeral music. And you could see that what it wasn't just one of the official morning ceremonies. It was that George VI was a very beloved monarch. Well, those are my thoughts on George VI, inspired by this Royal Mail. Oh, I want to say one last thing about the way they made toys in those days. This is metal. The tires are rubber and they come off. Okay, you can take the tires off. It's much closer to the real thing than all the plastic junk we have today. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and I look forward to talking with you the next time. Bye-bye.